So let's talk about something we've all seen, and maybe even felt. Political beliefs. They're not just opinions, are they? They're intense. In this explainer, we're going to get into the hidden psychology that wires our brains to not just pick a side, but to defend that choice like our lives depend on it. I mean, think about the last political argument you saw, maybe online or at a family dinner. It's almost never a calm, cool exchange of facts, right? It feels personal. It's charged. Both sides just dig in their heels, and it feels a lot less like a debate and more like a battle. Well, it turns out there's a really good reason for that. Our brains are running these powerful, totally invisible programs in the background that pretty much force us to defend our political tribe. Today, we're going to unpack two of the biggest ones and see exactly how they work.
All right, so the first piece of the puzzle starts long before we even think about casting a vote. You know, we like to imagine that we're these rational jurors, carefully weighing all the evidence before we decide. But the psychological reality? It's more like we walk into the courtroom already wearing our team's jersey. Our brains are already tilted, making us, in a very real sense, pre-convinced voters.
And that tilt has a name you've probably heard of: confirmation bias. This isn't just some fringe idea. It's one of the most solid, well-documented features of how our minds work. You can think of your brain as being less like a scientist trying to find the truth and more like a lawyer hired by your existing beliefs. Its job isn't to be objective. Its job is to win the case. So it goes out and finds evidence that proves its point, while at the same time it just ignores or minimizes or conveniently forgets any facts that might challenge it. And this isn't something we choose to do. It's a mental shortcut, a way to save energy. But in politics, that shortcut can lead us way, way off track.
Okay, so that's the theory. But what does this bias look like in the real world? It's one thing to define it, but it's another thing entirely to see it shaping our judgment when we don't even realize it's happening. A really cool study by researchers Lerman and Ackland designed this clever experiment to catch this exact bias in the act, and they used a topic that affects all of us: local government services.
So here's how they did it. Researchers gave people a description of a city service, something like garbage collection. Some of the participants read a story about a really high-quality, efficient service. On-time pickups, low costs, happy residents. But other people read about a terrible, low-quality service that was expensive and totally unreliable. Now, here's the most important detail. Nobody was told who was actually running the service.
And this is where the test really begins. After reading one of those stories, people were asked a really simple question. Who do you think ran this service? Was it the government or was it a private company? They had to fill in that blank using nothing but their own assumptions and their own pre-existing beliefs. So, what do you think happened?
The results were just crystal clear. People didn't guess randomly at all. Their answers were powerfully guided by what they already thought. As you can see right here from the study's findings, people who already had a negative view of the government were way more likely to assume that the crappy, expensive service was the public one and the efficient, cheap one was private. They didn't have the facts, so their brain just supplied a fact that fit their worldview. They used their bias to complete the picture, basically confirming what they already believed to be true.
Okay, so confirmation bias is shaping the information we see before we make up our minds. But what happens after we've actually committed? What happens in that moment when we step into the voting booth and pull the lever? Well, that single act of choosing flips a switch in our brain, and it triggers a totally different and, you could argue, an even more powerful psychological process. We usually think of things in a straight line. Our beliefs lead to our actions. I believe candidate X is the best, therefore I vote for them. Simple. But this quote from a huge study we're about to look at just turns that whole idea on its head. It suggests that causation is a two-way street. The action itself, the physical act of voting, can actually circle back and change or at least intensify the very beliefs that led to it in the first place. The action drives the preference.
So, if our actions can actually shape our beliefs, what's the psychological engine that's making that happen? Well, this brings us to our second big idea: cognitive dissonance. At its core, it's all about our deep, unconscious need for our actions and our self-image to be in perfect harmony. Think of cognitive dissonance as a kind of mental alarm bell. It's this psychological pain that goes off whenever there's a clash between who we think we are, a smart, competent person, and something we just did, like, say, making a choice that might turn out to have been wrong. That feeling of inner conflict is deeply uncomfortable. And to shut off that alarm, we become incredibly motivated to change something. And since you can't travel back in time to uncast your vote, the easiest thing to change is your belief about that vote.
There's a classic experiment that shows this perfectly. Researchers had people do a mind-numbingly boring task for a full hour, literally just turning pegs on a board.
Then, they were asked to lie to the next person in line and tell them the task was actually really fun. Now here's the twist. Some people were paid $20 for that lie, a lot of money back then, while others were paid a measly $1. Later, when they were asked what they really thought of the task, the group that was only paid a single dollar rated it as being way more enjoyable. Why? Well, $20 is a pretty good reason to tell a little white lie. You can tell yourself, I'm still an honest person, I just did it for the money. But $1? That's not enough justification. So to get rid of that painful dissonance of I'm an honest person, but I just lied for basically nothing, their brains unconsciously rewrote reality. They convinced themselves it wasn't a lie after all. That task was actually kind of fun.
Okay, that's a cool lab result, but does this same justification engine kick in for something as big and complicated as a presidential election? To figure that out, researchers Mullainathan and Washington used a brilliant natural experiment. That's a scenario that just happens in the real world that lets you make these really clean comparisons, no lab needed. And their tool was simply the legal voting age.
The design of this study was so clever. They compared two groups of young people who were, for all practical purposes, identical. So imagine it's 2 years after a big election. You've got a 19-year-old who was only 17 on election day, too young to vote. And then you have a 20-year-old who happened to be 18 and therefore could vote. Besides that one random fact of their birthday, their lives are incredibly similar. This setup perfectly isolates the effect of just one thing, the act of voting itself.
And the result? It was absolutely striking. 2 years later, when the researchers measured their political views, the group that had been old enough to vote showed dramatically more polarized opinions of the president. The study found that the young people who were eligible to vote were nearly 2 times as polarized as ineligible ones. By making that choice in the voting booth, they kicked off cognitive dissonance. And to justify that action and feel consistent, their brains unconsciously went to work strengthening their convictions, making their support for their candidate or their opposition to the other guy even stronger over time.
So now we have our two heavy hitters. Confirmation bias, which filters what we see before we decide, and cognitive dissonance, which hardens our beliefs after we decide. But here's the thing, these two forces don't operate separately. No, they actually link up and create this powerful, self-reinforcing psychological loop.
Let's just walk through this cycle of conviction. It all starts with your pre-existing beliefs. Then, confirmation bias kicks in and acts like your own personal filter bubble, showing you a constant stream of information that seems to perfectly agree with what you already think, which makes you feel confident and smart. Feeling totally validated, you make a public commitment. You cast your vote. And now, the second engine roars to life. Cognitive dissonance gets to work protecting that decision. To avoid the discomfort of buyer's remorse, your brain unconsciously strengthens your original belief. You start seeing your candidate's good qualities as even better, and their flaws as no big deal. This new, stronger belief then makes your confirmation bias filter even more powerful, and the whole cycle starts all over again, but stronger this time.
Okay, this is all fascinating stuff about the weird quirks of our minds, but why does it really matter for society? Well, because this internal cycle doesn't just stay inside our heads, it scales up. And when millions of these individual cycles are all running at the same time, they start to shape our collective political reality, from who gets elected to the very tone of our public conversations.
And this is where we see the real-world consequences. This cycle helps explain the incumbency advantage. Once you've voted for someone, cognitive dissonance makes you want to see them do well, so you view their performance more charitably, and you're more likely to vote for them again. It is a huge driver of political polarization. That voting age study shows that the simple act of casting a ballot makes our opinions more extreme. It also makes it incredibly difficult for us to accurately judge how well our leaders are doing, because our brains are actively trying to prove that our past vote was the right one. And get this, here's a really wild thought from the research. We always think higher voter turnout is the ultimate goal, but this cycle suggests it could actually lead to a more biased electorate, as more and more people get locked into justifying their choices, becoming less open to new facts. It's a powerful force shaping our democracy from the inside out.
So, when you put it all together, it paints a pretty humbling picture of our political selves. Our brains seem less like truth-seeking machines and more like dedicated PR agents for our past decisions, working around the clock to make us feel consistent and correct. Which leaves us with a final and pretty unsettling question to think about. If our minds are literally built to justify our choices, how can we ever truly know when we're wrong?